Copyright in these lectures is either owned by the ANU or a third party who has licensed the ANU to use it. Students may use the recording for personal study only. No lecture may be communicated online, copied or shared without the prior permission of the ANU.
But under this kind of condition, whether the arbitrage opportunity exists, and this is our next topic here. So, according to the journal, the price volatility increases with duration of bond, and thus creating greater risk capital needed. And similarly, consistent with higher price volatility, and the margin requirements are also higher, which can be verified by the negative swap spread. And thirdly, because long-term bond validates the agency cost theory of maturity choice, which maturities of liabilities don't match the maturity of assets. Taking all these factors into consideration, arbitrageurs are going to fail to fill in the gap due to the great cost. Therefore, we conclude here, cooperatives need to step in and fill in the gap, and this is what the gap filling here we're talking about. So, next I choose a graph here. It's gonna make the previous more more organized and easier to understand. Since we get the concept of gap filling, the next we're gonna talk about the thesis statement. The gap filling behavior is an important determinant of very long-term issues. Okay, yeah. So next one we're gonna talk about the three main research questions, which is going to help us to understand the thesis statement. First one, to what extent a very long-term corporate debt issuer responds to the changes in credit market conditions? And secondly, what type of borrowers have the greatest supply elasticity with respect to the changes in credit conditions? And the last one, to what extent do the changes in mature composition of treasury bonds and the term structure of interest rates affect the propensity of the fund to issue the debt? So in order to figure out this question, in the next part, we're going to talk about the data overview.
Thank you. So let's move on to the second part, the data overview. So in this part, firstly, we're going to talk about the data source. So where is the data from? And then we will talk about data selection. So what kind of data will be selected in this research? Okay, so first thing first, so this research uses a database of the corporate borrowing by public U.S. companies over the 1987 to 2009 period. So there are two main databases. First is the Thomson Reuters LPC deal scheme. It provides the corporate loans, including bank and non-bank lenders. And another one is the Thomson Reuters SDC Platoon. It provides newly issued debt, US Rule 144A non-convertible debt, and the medium-term note programs. So after collecting all the data, the authors also get rid of some most secured debt, such as asset or mortgage-backed debt, secured debt, pass-through security, equipment trust certificate, lease obligation, and some convertibles. And then they only focus on the US dollar denominated debt issues and some bank borrowings. So you may ask why the period is from 1987 to 2009 period. That's due to the limitation of the Thomson Reuters LPC deal scheme. And you may also ask why they only focus on the US companies. That's because all the US companies, they get the same exposure to the changes of the tax law. And also, they expect that US companies are more susceptible to the changes of debt maturity structure. Okay, and then after they collected all the data, they also made some adjustments to the inflation to the 2009 by using the Bureau of Labor Statistics CPI. And they also supplement the insurance database with firm-level financial data. There are three main measurements, and the first one is the supply of long-term treasury. It's measured by the fraction of the outstanding treasury debt maturing over 20 years, denoted by TSY20. And the second one is a credit market condition measure. It is a spread between the percentage yields of the Moody's 30-year BBB and AAA rated bond. And the last one is a term structure measure. It is spread between the percentage yields of the 10-year and 6-month treasury security. So regarding the credit market condition measure. The advantage is that it provides a measure of risk premium in the long end of the term structure, and it is available on a monthly basis for the entire sample period. But there do exist some disadvantage, because the AAA bond yields may reflect changes in the supply of long-term treasuries. Okay, based from the previous literature suggests that there exists negative correlation between the credit spreads and the fraction of the long-term treasury debt. But based on the data that the authors collected, they found that there also exists negative correlation between the credit spreads and the fraction of the short-term treasury debt. So in order to address this concern, they introduced the credit risk premium. So after more processing of data, they got the results that there exists positive correlation between the BB to BBB and the fraction of the treasury debt mature in 20 years or more. So which this mitigates the concerns that the short-term debt capture the changes of the supply of long-term treasury debt. Okay, so that's all for this part, and thank you. Let's move on to the next part.
Right. For the empirical analysis, we have divided this part into 4 sections. And for this part, it just focuses on using the data and model to explain what the statements we have mentioned in part A. All right, we firstly go to the descriptive statistic. Before going into the detail of the data, I'd love to do some review about the research question. Has anyone still remember we have divided the core problem, what determinants of long-term debt issues, into the three researching questions. The first one would be that, like, to what extent the corporate will respond to the credit markets. And the second one is what types of firms will respond to this kind of changes. And the third one would be what kind of changes in the credit markets will affect the preference of the issuers. Now, always keep this question in your mind, and we'll go into the detail about the data. All right, let's have a look at this table. Actually, it's not as complicated as you see. So before we go into the detail about the data, I would love to first introduce the structure of this table. We can see there's 5 intervals of the years, which is consistent with the formal literature review. And it's convenient for us to do the analysis in the next part. And then we can see here have the 2 panels. Actually, this table have 4 panels. We can see the next 2 panels in the next slides. And here, the 4 panels are respectively summarize the data from different perspectives. Panel A is about the credit markets, and panel B is about the firm's characteristics. Then C and D is not really important in this part because they are just the summarize of the, you can treat it as the classification of different investment level of the firms. All right, we can see firstly about the credit markets. We can see this line, the bank debt, the bank debts. The data of the mean is gradually decreasing as the years increasing. So what we have found is this part is the occupation of bank debt in the credit markets is decreasing. Even in the year 1 and 5, they have the occupations of over 90%, whereas in the 20 years and more, they only have 3.4 occupations in the credit markets. So here we have answered question 1 that they found the gap in the credit markets. That is, the government bond is really limited in 2 years maturity and over. Also, what need mentioned is that we can see here the callable ratio is dramatically increasing since the years from 5 and upper. From the panel B, we can see the detail about the firms. Firstly, we take a look at the total asset and market value. The value obviously is very high in the bond, which is less than 1 year and more than 20 years. And the debt ratio is obviously very relative high in 1 year to less than 10 years. So from here we can summarize that the company who has issued the bonds like short-term and long-term over 20 years has a less leverage ratio, and they obviously is larger in the firm size. If we only see the 20 years bond, if we only see the intervals of 20 years and over bonds, this column, we can also find that 89% of this company who issue 20 years bond have the ability to pay their dividends. And also 91.5% percentage of this kind of issuers, they are at the investment ranking level, which is over BBB. All right, this is another table about table 3. This table has classified all the firms according to their investment grading ranking. What we have mentioned before, like upper than BBB, they have the investment rated. And then we can see the corporation who has issued 20 bonds yield and over only have 49 firms is under the investment level. Thus, to summarize what kind of firms will have the response to this kind of credit changes in credit markets is that long-term issuers looks like larger and less leverage, have the high return on asset, and more likely to be in an investment grade rating than short-term. And then this is the next part about the empirical evidence. My teammates will develop the further analysis in this part, so I will just brief mention about that. Which the purpose of this section is to find the reason behind those data we have viewed in the last part. So we have to propose these 3 kind of causes about those data we have saw in the last part. Is the first that long-term debt issuers are more sensitive to the changes of market condition, and high-quality issuers is more sensitive to the changes of market condition. Then the market condition changes will affect the preference firms. This method, they are using the regression model, and my teammates will further introduce about this part.
Okay, so in this part, I will talk about the models used to analyze the data. It relates the likelihood of debt maturity choices of companies to the market condition and firm characteristics. This model has the advantage that it allows us to account for nonlinear effect of both firm characteristics and the maturity choices of company. The disadvantage of this model is that it provides an estimate of supply responses conditional on the issuance of debt. However, Treasury supply's impact on the corporation debt's impact might not only be constrained to substituting away from long-term to short-term and medium-term debt. In model the multinomial logic model, we model the short-term debt with 0 to 1 year, short to medium-term debt with maturities of 1 to 5 years, medium-term debt with maturities of 5 to 10 years, medium to long-term debt with maturities of 10 to 20 years, and very long-term debt with 20 plus years. It does not matter, theoretically, it does not matter which category we choose as a reference category. We choose 5 to 10 years as our base category because this section is associated with most of the issuance activities, and 5 to 10 years matches our debt maturities of our sample companies. This panel presents the multinomial logic model of the coefficient. As we can see, for TSY20, the only coefficient that is negative and statistically significant is for corporate debt with maturities of 20 plus years, which it indicates that only for the very long-term debt, the increase in Treasury debt will decrease the issuance of corporate debt with very long-term end. This panel presents us with a marginal effect of 4 firms rated A to AAA. As we can see, for TSY20, the only coefficient that is negative and statistically significant is for 20-year plus debt. It indicates that for 1% increase in the long-term treasuries, there will be a 2.6% decrease in the very long-term corporate debt. And it also indicates that conditional on corporate debt issuing, with the increase in the very long-term treasury, the corporate will substitute away from long-term debt to medium-term debt and short-term debt. This panel estimates the multinomial audit model for subsamples of our data. The first column presents all the rated firms with bank loans and debt. The column 2 distinguishes between bond issues and bank loans. And column 3, we exclude the bank loans and control for the callable debt. For all of the models, the industry fixed effect accounts for most of the explained variations in terms of long-term debt issues. And in terms of the credit market factors, TSY20 explains the greatest amount of within-firm variability in terms of long-term issues for highly rated firms. Next, let's welcome my colleague.
Thanks to my teammates. Now, let me finish the rest of the empirical analysis. It seems we record the 3 questions again, in case you got lost, and also we want to stress the importance of these 3 questions. The first 2 are the authors want to know what kind of debts is long-term or short-term, and what type of firms is high-rated or low-rated. They are more sensitive to the issuance of the long-term treasuries. And the last question is if the long-term treasuries insurance will influence the firm's tendency to borrow more or less. So let's begin this question. The hypothesis is also think the gap filling incentives may also influence a firm's tendency to borrow, and they believe that the policy QE2 in 2009 is tried to induce long-term corporate borrowing through purchase of long-term treasury bonds. So let's see how they test the hypothesis. Also, they select all rated firms in our original samples and collect the relevant data to build up logic models. We can see, like for example, for the long-term debt, they set y equal to 1 if the firm have issued a long-term debt in that year, and if not, it is 0. And for another model like short-term, if the firm issued the short-term debt, the y equal to 1 or 0 if they not. And the x variables, you can see the variables as we have seen before in the previous tables. But they do some adjustment. They lagged by 1 period, and some data are 12 months averages because we see it's yearly data. And let's see the logical regression results. We can see the first 2 columns. The first 2 columns are short-term debt issuance and long-term debt issuance, respectively. And the third column just at interaction term for the long-term issuance. And the first column is they restrict the sample into rated firms that issue long-term debt at any point in time. We can see the results. We can see the first column, the whole column. There's no stars here, which means all these coefficients are not significant. So we can conclude that there's no significant relationship between short-term debt issue and the changes of supply of short-term treasury debt. But the other 3 columns we can all see from these coefficients. We can see there's a significantly and negative relationship between long-term debt issues and the supply of long-term treasuries. We can also see control some form-specific characteristics. And there are some patterns here. For example, for larger, more profitable long-term asset firms, they are more likely to issue long-term debt. And this table are the same logic models, but we can see the panel B. They restrict the sample. They make the sample smaller. They just pick firms rated A and to AAA, and also we can see the same results. There's still significantly a negative relationship between the supply of long-term treasuries and the issues of long-term debts. For example, this number shows any 1% decrease in supply of long-term treasuries increase the likelihood of issuing long-term debts by 1.4%. And it's only for highly rated long-term issuers, we can see here. And to further examine the impact of shifts in treasury supply on borrowing, also they do run a linear model. They build up a linear model. They examine the firm fixed effects of the annual changes in total debt outstanding for the rated firms. They set Y equal to annual changes in total debts over total assets. And the X variables are those determinants we've seen before. And also they do some firm-specific controls. We can see the linear regression results. These columns are like similar to we've seen before. The second one add in the interaction terms. They multiply the rating and the issuance of long-term treasuries. And third one still like restrict the sample into long-term issuers, which means they issue long-term debt at any point in our sample periods. And all these numbers shows for highly rated firms, there are significantly and a negative relationship between changes in corporate borrowing and the supply of long-term treasury bonds. And also we can see the firm-specific characteristics. We can see there's for the investment spending and firm profitability are positive related to the total debt, while the firm overall leverage are negatively related to the total debt. So far, we can see we have already seen the results. The answer for the question if the gap filling can influence the long-term debt, the firm's tendency to borrow long-term debt, to issue long-term debts. And the answer is yes, but it's only for the firm who are highly rated. There's a significant relationship between changes in corporate borrowing and the supply of long-term treasuries. While for the less rated firms, there's no such relationships. So that's my part. Let's welcome my teammate to show the robust test.
Okay, so now I'm going to take over from part 4, endogeneity concerns. This part is divided into 3 subsections. The first one is an overview, solution, and summary. Let's start with the overview. Endogeneity is so important in discovering causal relationships among variables. If it exists, it means the model we applied fails to capture the causation works in the real world. In this specific paper, the main concern is that changes in the supply of treasury debt may respond endogenously to same factors that also influence corporate maturity choice, but just in the opposite direction. In order to address this issue, this paper introduced an event study on the suspension of third-year treasuries announced by the US government. This suspension is considered an exogenous event as it isolated the effects of investors' demand on the supply of long-term corporate bond issuance. the first step of this study is to find whether there is a supply shock led by the suspension event. The hypothesis is that if there is a supply shock on the long-term treasury bonds led by the suspension event, then a significant decrease in yield is expected. As the table shows, the CAR event, which stands for Cumulative Abnormal Return Event, is a proxy for the decrease in yield, and its coefficient is positively significant for 30-year treasury bonds. This is because the target of the suspension is for 30-year treasuries. So the next step, the paper tries to investigate how the corporate bonds, long-term corporate bonds, respond to the supply shock. The paper evaluates the changes in the fraction of 30-year corporate bonds relative to the fraction of 20-year corporate bonds during the period of 1998 to 2001 and the period 2002 to 2005. And the paper found that there is a significant increase in all issuance of long-term corporate debts, especially for investment-grade bonds. The increase is about 20%, whereas for issues rated BBB, the increase is not that obvious. Lastly, the paper tries to relate the supply shock with the changes in the long-term corporate bond issuance. They do so by using a regression discontinuity analysis. The basic idea of this analysis is to set a post-event dummy variable in the model, where the dependent variable is the fraction of total new issuance with maturities exceeding 30 years relative to the corporate bonds with maturities exceeding 20 years. And as the table shows, the first two columns in panel A is the coefficient for this post-event dummy variables. They are positively significant. This is for all issues. If we move to panel B, which only includes issues rated A to AAA, we can see that the coefficients are all significant in all four columns. But the situation is completely reversed in panel C, which it only includes issues rated BBB. So by conducting the above three steps, we can conclude that the suspension of 30-year treasury bonds actually led an unexpected supply shock, and it caused a gap-filling behavior in the very long-term corporate bonds market, especially for investment-grade bonds. Therefore, the endogeneity concerns in this paper is successfully addressed. The last section is conclusion. So overall, the objective of this paper is to examine the key determinants of long-term corporate debt issuance. And the main findings are debt issues of 20 years or more are common for highly rated firms, and there is an inverse relationship between the proportion of outstanding debt and issuance. However, little evidence shows that the issues of short-term maturity bonds are related to the changes in the supply of short or long-term bonds. And the results suggest that the market conditions, in particular the supply of long-term treasuries, are extremely important determinants of investment-grade bonds issuing. And these long-term unsecured debts are a choice available principally to investment-graded issuers. Lastly, changes in the supply of long-term treasuries are negatively related to the propensity of high-grade firms' borrowings. That's the end of our presentation. Thank you for listening. Any question is welcome.
Okay, I do have some questions, but maybe I will wait until the discussion group done their job. Yeah, so very good. I think like the thing that I like, and I think like a big improvement from a year ago that I taught the class, like made more and more students that be able to fluently present instead of rely on the notes and readings, you know. And I think like as a reference for your future presentation as well, what I'm expecting is like when you read the paper and then how you're gonna digest the paper and how you're gonna digest it in a way that make it more intuitive and illustrative in your slide, right? So if I can see that the preparation of a slide is simply a copy and paste from the paper without further value added, in between that you actually provide, then it's actually, because I'm gonna have like point for presentation, like how fluently you present, and also the content and the slide. So the slide is like something about a formality, like, the illustrative part that you make things more eye-catching and, visualize things, so then, some kind of a concept, maybe it's very difficult to understand if you just write down sentence by sentence, too much text, right? But if you just visualize it in a little box here and there, then maybe it's easier to understand that way, So I can see that some parts that you did pretty well, that you try to frame things in a certain way, and I like the structure as well. I think it's very, kind of very well structured in terms of the content of the presentation.
Sorry, can I
Yeah.
have a question?
Yeah.
Actually, I continue confused with the definitions of gap filling behavior.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they told me the normally about because the long-term debt in many sectors,
Yeah.
it is really low.
Mm.
So it is one kind of gap filling behavior for corporate finance.
In fact, I can answer the question because my partner, from the start, from the introduction part, she already explained this, but I can explain more if that can help.
Yeah, I remember you got some definition down here about the gap fillings, right? The very first
So,
slide.
for gap
But
filling
maybe,
is like because the markets have demand for the long-term debt. The investors, they want to invest long-term, but for the supply of long-term treasuries, if the supply decrease, then there's more demand. And then the arbitrager can take the opportunity to issue more like long-term debt, but there's arbitrage cost is too high. So only the better high-rated firms, they can issue more long-term debt to fill the gap, to take the benefits. So that's gap filling. That's my understanding.
And you think that gap filling behavior here is from investor perspective, not from firm perspective?
It's
Sorry,
from form, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I think the gap filling is from the corporate perspective.
Yeah.
It's like there's a shock in the credit markets that the governments and the banks, they no longer issue long-term bonds or like more than 20 years, but they have the demand. Some fund like insurance or some pension, they want to invest in long-term bonds which is secure. So, but the government don't have this kind of bonds. Then the corporate then the corporates, they find this gap, so they want to fill it. Am I clearly answer that question?
Your answer constantly mentioned about investor perspective.
No,
Yeah.
I think the
Yeah.
corporation, right? The issuers. So what
Yeah.
we said is that the issuers do find opportunities in the long-term bonds that haven't been provided by the Treasury, right? So that is why they enter to the market and then issue the long-term bonds. So it's not really because of the demand of the long-term bonds, but because they see the opportunities vacant there, right? Nobody actually provide funding for this. Yeah.
And gap filling here is
Yeah.
mean that because in the total markets,
Mm.
they less of G3
Mm.
and the longer terms
Yeah.
maybe investment opportunity. So the firm want to get this like
To fill the gap of the treasury market. So normally, I think the very long-term bonds, I think the government would be the one who's the best to issue a very long-term bond, right? Because they got reputation, right? So if it's just an unknown company, whether you can dare to buy like 30 years bond, because you're not really sure after 30 years they're still there, right? So I think government got a very good reputation in terms of issuing a very long-term bond, but for some reason there is a shock in the supply, and then it's actually introduced the opportunities for corporation to step in, to fill those gaps. Yeah. So it's what I understand from their presentation.
But in that slide, they saw that
the banks do not issue enough long-term debt.
Okay.
The number is quite low.
Yeah.
That so makes me confused that maybe
You mean-
misunderstand.
You mean this part? You mean like this part?
Next, when you have some sentence here. That you sold here bank debt and you say that if credit markets have to gap.
Yeah, because they are from the bank debt, we are just reckon this as the government's issue bonds, like the really secured bonds in this credit markets, because they have the occupations of 99% at the lower, and they have 90% of 1 to 5, but they only have 3.4 percentage. They only occupy 3.4 percentage of this credit markets. So that's the gap where the corporation want to fill.
So even the financial institution that they don't really very active in a very long-term bond,
Yeah.
so the percentage, yeah, okay, makes sense.
Is that clear?
Okay.
I think it's different incentive from your explanation.
Yeah.
Because if you say that bank debt is a credit market has a gap, it means that the bank do not have support longer term loan for corporate, is that right?
No, for investor. it
No.
can be any type of
This
investor.
is from the perspective of issuers, as the corporation are the issuers. They need the money, so they issue the bonds. And like the governments, they don't issue the bonds. Bonds is the products. It's the market of bonds, and there's a lot of, sorry, can I just, you can treat it as the demand and supply. It's like, sorry, this one is supply, this one is demand.
Yeah.
Like some insurance company, they want the safe bond. They want to buy this safe bond, so they have demand like really high. But
I know.
the
but
supply is
I
really
just
low.
About bank debt. I understand.
Yeah,
the concept.
the bank debt is from the
Bank debt
supply.
related to this.
The bank debt is from the supply perspective, because the governments don't supply as much as they want. They are just supply as this part, but this quantity is what the market demand, and this quantity is what the supply, what the government supply. So here they have the gap, and the governments and the corporation want to fill this gap.
But I think it's different. Bank debt is the money, the money they invest on firm, but the corporate bond, it means that the firm borrow money from the market, from investors.
The government debt is they want the money from the market, so they issue the bonds. Is that right?
So I don't get a little lost, I think. Yeah, anyway, I think we can bring up the discussion later on because of the time constraint. Yeah, maybe we can talk about that when we got time at the end of the lecture. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. I understand this is quite a difficult paper to digest, and I'm actually looking forward to the discussion group to see like how they actually gonna do the critics of the paper. Okay? Yeah, so please come up.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today, our presentation will focus on the discussion of this paper. We have 5 parts of this presentation. The first one is summary, and the second part is data selection, and the third part is methodology. The The fourth part is event study, and the last part is other determinants. And firstly, I will give a brief introduction of this paper. So this paper has a major assumption, which is based on gap filling. Gap filling can be simply summarized as if the supply of long-term government bonds decreases, then the corporate bonds issuers, especially those with high credit ratings, tend to issue corporate bonds to fill the gap. And this paper have two major hypotheses. That is, the highly rated firms' issuance of long-term bonds is inversely related to long-term treasury bonds. And moreover, they are more sensitive to changes in the supply of long-term treasuries. And after the analysis, it focused on two major results. The first one is highly rated firms' issuance of long-term bonds is inversely related to long-term treasury bonds, which is consistent with the hypothesis first. And moreover, there is a little evidence for short-term corporate bonds are related to changes in supply of long or short-term treasuries. And the second conclusion is the changes in the supply of long-term treasuries are negatively related to the propensity of high-grade firms to borrow. We have found 4 structure issues. And the first one is about the title. The title of this paper is too general. The title should reflect the contents of work precisely and concisely. But the title of this paper, The Determinants of Long-Term Corporate Debt Issuance, at the first glance, which seems like to indicate that it will talk about many different kinds of determinants of the long-term corporate debt issuance, but it did not. And the second one is about keywords. This paper has no keywords. And keywords encapsulate the main topics of the research and make the article contents to be accessed easily. So it's better to have some keywords. For example, gap filling, debt maturity choice, supply of long-term treasurers. And thirdly, the second reason of his hypothesis is not logically appropriate. It is that very long-term issues are difficult to explain by agency cost, series, or maturity choice. So the gap filling might be the appropriate explanation. But how to eliminate effects of other determinants? This paper did not give us an answer. And finally, due to the limitations, this paper's practicality remains to be further discussed. And then comes to the second part.
Thank you. My part is mainly about the focus on the limitation of possible negative effect of the sample period selection between the 1987 to 2009. At the same time, the causal factors will also be mentioned. Why the bond yield fluctuate violently within that period, and emphasize 2 possible reasons. Let's zoom these pictures. Like at the horizontal bottom side, here is all of the data that we collected for the 10-year monthly treasury bonds. And within the shadow part, it contains the time period used by the authors, which fluctuate really strongly, as you can see. And it reached to a peak at nearly 9.52% on the October 1987 here, and it drops. It appears a downward ladder-like waves. It drops to the 2.42% on November 2009. As for government bonds, this period can be regarded as the most volatile one, altering from the top to the recession. There must be plenty of the reason to explain the causal effect for the fluctuation, and I will emphasize two of them. Primarily, the economic consequences of the war launched by U.S. in the end of the last decade include Cold War with the Soviet Union and during the late 1970s to the mid-1980s, and the Iraq and Afghanistan wars beginning from these centuries. Both attract my attention, and I will detect them deeply. Like during the Cold War, the military expenditure sustainable increase alongside lower tax rate to stimulate the market, which lead a blowout in budget deficit. The debt-driven consumption was funneled, and higher government bonds caused higher interest rate in terms. The complicated market condition add more uncertainty to be measured with the credit spread. Compared to the flourished economy within the Cold War, the Iraq and Afghanistan that were accompanied with the weak market condition. And unlike the Cold War period, the Bush tax cuts eliminates the tax part offset, and the military outlays entirely financed by the debts. And adjointly with the low tax rate, a loose monetary policy is announced as well, which caused unsustainable structural imbalance in government finance. And subsequently, the total market condition deteriorated, especially after the peak year for the Iraq military spending in 2009. Thus, it is reasonable to combine the recession at this time. That's what I mentioned at about 2.45%. In general, the uncertainty from the policies, regulation, and external market environment changes with the market reaction. Using the gap, just use the gap filling to explain, I think it's not appropriate. And in addition, I think when we all read this article, the first impression comes to our mind must be global financial crisis. And the collapse of the Lehman Brothers sent fear around the world financial market. Virtually, the bank ceasing to lending to the others, and the interbank rates shoot up according to my research, it's about 5% from nearly zero. And the companies stopped borrowing, and the capex project shelved. So the gap filling conclusion as a negative relation, I think is not suitable here as well. And besides this analysis above, the reason why the author picked this period can be categorized to two parts. Firstly, this part is comparable closer to the present, so it can have more meaningful to focus the current relation. Secondly, it generally illustrates with a downward trend, which is followed by the long-term government bond market till now. Therefore, simple just change to another time period may not be sufficient. But the researchers need to put more efforts to control the other factors during this period. Otherwise, the conclusion will remain several bias, and maybe within that bias, there may be some influential point as well. And here is all I'm gonna talk about. And my another roommate will talk about the limitation of the data selection from the U.S.-dominated specific firm. Thank you.
Thank you. Although the author found there is a significant negative relationship between the long-term debt issue and the supply of government treasury bonds based on U.S. communist data. However, the question is this result suitable for other countries like the European countries, Australia, or some developing countries like China, India, and so on? Because the author just use the United States data. Really, three factors that make the result different in other countries: the different debt market condition, the different influence to economy and debt market during GFC, and different firm condition. This table shows government security issue of different countries. As we can see in this table, the United
outstanding government security in 1997 is more than 6,000 billions. And other countries like Japan, France, United Kingdom is extremely lower than the United States, and Australia is only about 80 billions. There is other example also about Australian corporate bond market. By comparison to foreign markets, Australia's corporate bond market is underdeveloped as measured by size, size and stability. On average, only 30 bonds are issued in the Australian corporate bond market per year, and Australian SMEs typically do not have a size to capital debt market, and therefore must rely on bank borrowing or issuing equity. From the article, we know that the author found the high-rating companies preferred and can easily use the very long-term debt and the very short-term debt. However, the lower-rating companies mainly focus on the intermediate debt, but in Australia it's a different story, because it is really hard for such company with lower rating to issue debt, even if the intermediate debt. Therefore, it is easy to see that the corporate bond market in different countries is totally different. We know that the data the author use include the GFC time period, which may make the result inaccurate. These two tables show the influence on GDP and the real interest rates of different countries by GFC. The first one is United States, and the other country is like Australia and other Asian countries. We mainly focus on the green line, the temporal effect. From the GDP perspective, we can see that there is a significant decrease of United States GDP compared to other countries like Australia and other Asian countries. From the real interest rate perspective, we found that different countries has a different decreasing level, which means that it may have a different influence to the local bond market. The last factor is from the firm level perspective. We know America is a main market, which includes lots of great and famous companies like Apple, Microsoft, IBM. I think it's too much. However, the question is, it is very hard for us to find comparable companies in other countries with similar scale, similar reputation. In other words, American market is too special because it has too much such influential and famous companies. Therefore, we think there is a big difference of corporation data between other countries and America. To be concluded, all these factors may make the result not suitable for other countries. This is my part. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I'm going to talk about some improvements and problems in methodology in this article. First, our author create a multinomial logic model to test the TSY20 long-term treasury bond over 20 years, which represent gap fillings impact on debt maturity choice. And the result found that TSY20 has impact on short-term and very long-term debt issues. And then we limited our database to high-rated firms and found that the TSY20 has the result not only on short-term and the very long-term debt, but also on the short to medium-term debt issues. So there is a swift relationship among these three kinds of debts. However, the author did not clarify the swift relationship among this kind of debt. Is the very long-term debt swift to the short, and then the short swift to the short to medium, or the very long-term debt swift both to the short-term and the short to medium-term debt? So here becomes our first improvement in this article. Next, our author separate the very long-term debt into different subsamples: high-rated firms, non-high-rated firms, bonds, bank loans, and separate bonds into non-callable and callable. And finally found that non-callable bonds has the highest
elastic to TSY20 gap fillings impacts. We know that the TSY20 represent the gap filling, so how important are gap fillings and credit market conditions generally in explaining maturity choice? We use the analysis of covariance, and finally we found that gap fillings can explain 12% maturity choice. Then we recall the last model we used. We found that TSY has the impact on short-term, short to medium-term, and very long-term debt issues, and there is a swift relationship among these three kinds of debts. And then we want to find out that the propensity to borrow, which means after the internal swift among these three kinds of debt and external in and out, what's the final effect? What's the final amount of each kind of debt issues? The amount, right? Final amount is increase or decrease. However, our author only takes on the very long-term debt. He ignored the impact on short-term and the short to medium-term debt. So here we comes our second improvements in this article to test TSY20 impact on short-term and short to medium-term debt propensity to borrow. Let's see how the author do the propensity to borrow of very long-term debt. He used a comparison here. Use the TSY1 short-term treasury bond tax on the short-term debt to be a comparison in this model. However, this comparison is too simple to use it. If you want to do the comparison, you also need to do the TSY1 tax on the very long-term debt, and also you need to tax TSY20 impact on the short-term debt. And you also need to clarify the relationship between TSY1 and the TSY20. So this comes the third problem, the comparison problem in this article. As we know the propensity to borrow in each kind of debt, we also want to know the totally debt changes in the model. So we create a linear model. So that's the logic of the and the problem in the methodology.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. Next, I'm going to talk about another issue in model construction. In empirical models of debt maturity choice, the author, a linear model is used to capture the nonlinear relationship. And it can cause some bias in the reference and the comparison. Now let's refresh the model. The dependent variable is years to maturity. And the independent variables are fraction of child debt over 1 year and the average maturity of child debt and the fraction of child debt over 20 years. One thing I want to mention is that there are three models constructed with respect to these three independent variables. And these are the control variable. Why the linear model can cause bias? I think this question is kind of like what we have learned in advanced investment. See, when you want to capture, when you want to approximate a curve with its tendency, a straight line. So the problem here can be separated in two parts. The first one is the significance. In the linear model, we find no significant relationship between the maturity of cooperative debt and the fraction of child debt over 1 year. But probably there might be some relationship that the linear model cannot capture. So we think this is the first problem. Another problem is coefficients. We know in nonlinear model, the marginal effect can change while the explanatory variable change, while it's fixed in linear model. So when we want to compare the three independent variables, which one is more sensitive? This the coefficients might not increase and not persuasive. And the next part is event study. In this part, the author addressed the indigeneity concerns by examining the impact of the government policy. A constant return model is used here. The assumption of constant return model is that the treasury yield is randomly distributed around the long-term mean. So when the return is too much away from the mean return, there must be some new information in the market. So this is based on the market efficiency hypothesis. Next. An important constraint of this model is that the mean return during the estimation window should not be affected by the event. But there are some cases which might trigger this problem. One thing is that the market participants might have anticipated this event. Another thing is that there might be an information leak. So in these two cases, some market participants may respond or react to the market before the event. So this may cause inaccuracy. Let's see a graph. It's a yield of 30-year Treasury bond. We know the government policy is released on the 31st of October, and on 19th of September, we can see a dramatic decrease, downward trend. It's about 1 month before the event. And on the 23rd of October, it's 1 week before the event. We can also see a significant drop. We think it is hard to identify whether there is an information leak or whether some market participants have anticipated the event. But we think it is very necessary to add a gap between the estimation window and the event window. Another issue in event study is that we think the estimation window is not appropriate. Let's go back to the graph again. We can see the graph is very volatile, and we might see that from the long run, the return is fluctuate around 5.6%. But I don't think the return, the trial yield is constant in a daily basis. So this is the first problem. Another problem is that the shaded area is the recession caused by dot-com bubble. The estimation window is 1 year before the government policy release, and we can see from the graph, about 2/3 of the period is during this recession, and the government policy release is exactly at the end of the recession. So we think the estimation period is too special to be representative. So we think it, of course, it is impossible to escape this period or escape the recession. But we can extend the estimation period and make it longer to contain more information during the normal time. That's what Dr. Lewin.
I want to introduce some other determinants which may affect the issue of long-term debt. In the article, the author thinks that gap filling is a predominant element, and the asset matching and agency problems can hardly explain this phenomenon. However, after we read some articles, we found there are other elements which are really important, and the author didn't take into considerations. The first one is the multiple large shareholders. The main conclusion associated with multiple large shareholders is that the controlling owners tend to avoid frequent monitoring by lenders, so they usually will choose longer maturity debt. And the presence of multiple large shareholders and short-term debt limit the ability of controlling owner to extract private benefits. So from this aspect, multiple large shareholders really have impact on the issue of long-term debt. And here is the graph. This graph mainly reports the relationship between the multiple large shareholder and the maturity. It is obvious that the multiple large shareholder is negatively related to the issue of long-term debt, and this coefficient is statistically significant at 1% level. And this supports the conclusion that multiple large shareholders provide monitoring over controlling owners, which reduce their preference of using long-term debt and increase the use of short-term debt. The second element is overconfidence. In fact, there is a positive relationship between overconfidence and debt maturity. And this relationship effect is intensified for firms with high underinvestment problems. And because overconfident CEOs have the belief that they have private information regarding the firm's future performance, so they will choose the short-term debt to minimize the perceived mispricing of their securities. And they also alt the debt structure, so use a higher large proportion of short-term debt. The last one is audit choice. In the article about audit choice, the author used the information about American companies, and it found that the Big Four clients worldwide enjoy longer debt maturity. It implies that high-quality audits substitute for short-term debt for monitoring purpose. However, this relationship is weaker outside the United States. Overall, we think that it is unreasonable for author to draw the conclusion that gut feeling is the predominant element just because agency problems and asset matching can hardly explain the issue of long-term debt. And we think more determinants should be taken into consideration and make this conclusion more apparent. Here are our references. And that's all for our discussion. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether I can catch everything that you present today, but I can see that the huge amount of effort that you try to digest and try to analyze the paper with different angles, and also the way that you bring in a lot of outside information, like, you know, analyze it in the context of Australia. I really like that point, in the sense, you know, so you give the fact that the activities of long-term bond issuance in Australia is not that active as compared to the US, right? So maybe the interpretation of gap fillings in the US may not be applicable in Australia. You know, and then I think also a point about very large firms in the US, you know, there is no, I think this is Monday, right? We discussed that there is no comparable non-US firm that can be comparable to Microsoft or, you know, Apple or something like that. Then the reputation of the US firm, you know, to substitute the reputation of government, you know, that kind of condition is not applicable for other countries. So I think very many good points. So I noted here. So the title, even very simple, but I like it too. I agree. When I read the title, I think it's too generic. You know, I don't see this down to the gap fillings paper, you know. So I think that maybe something more specific about gap fillings should be brought up to the title. Or just, you know, because when you read that, I agree with you that it's going to be more about the general analysis of every possible determinants of long-term corporate issuance, right? So it's something good point to raise. What else? Yeah, and I think like you got some information even from Federal Reserve Board, and I think I also agree with the large, the presence of large shareholders. You know, so this is, you know, play an important role in the agency costs, right? So the paper try to rule out the impact of agency costs on the long term, and I agree with you that issuing the long term actually mitigate a lot of the monitoring effect, right? Because we always know that bank monitoring is always dominant with the diversified investor from the bond market, right? Because if you are just an individual investor, you'll not be able or have any clue that the firm is going on. You know, so that is why the monitoring from the bond market, you know, is actually way much weaker than the bank monitoring. You know, so then the role of large shareholders, I think, matters a lot. Overconfidence, I agree with the point of overconfidence as well. So the CEO overconfidence may prefer more short term, just be able, because they think that it's gonna be able to justify or to be, you know, flexible with their performance rather than fixed in a very long term contract, right? What else? Yeah, I think like a lot of points about Cold War and Iraq War, like I'm not really. I think it's nice to bring them up, but maybe I need some elaboration. What did you mean? Like why it actually matters? Maybe you can clarify to your friends as well. So this sounds very big to me, but how does that matter to the gap filling hypothesis in the paper?
Because I just wanna ask for in this article,
yeah.
The author wanna determine the relationship between two factors, but I think there may be during that sample period, there is more factors they need to control, but they didn't mention. Okay. And when I search for that period, I find something really interesting. U.S. always launch for the war, but the war is more like about the external market. It will have the influence on the external market, but these factors are very hard to control. But
then how does that impact? So you think that those elements or those information or condition is going to impact the long-term treasury provision, or is it going to impact the corporation incentive to issue long-term bonds for gap filling? So
I think both, because as for the government, they will issue the different policy, like the Bush tax cut. It's really odd, but they issue it. But at that time, the company, they will have the react with the government, the market environment.
So I agree. I think at some point it may have some effects. For example, it's about consumption or something like that, right?
So it's all about the uncertainty, I think.
Yes, it may relevant. I think if we kind of elaborate a little more. Yeah. Anyway, thank you very much. I don't know whether you guys have any other question.
I was wondering, based on what I read the paper, it seems like companies they're backfilling, they're filling the gaps for where the government drops out or even where banks start to drop out. But I'm actually wondering, if they're doing that under those circumstances, in the situational scenarios where the government doesn't drop out and is actually continuing to put supply into the market, does that mean most companies are technically under leveraged and they're always just looking for opportunities to become more leveraged than they are, and hence are not at their optimal capital structure?
Also, you mean that how does that impact the leverage of firms when they issue very long-term bonds?
Not necessarily how it impacts, but if all these companies are just waiting for opportunities or scenarios for when the government drops out, does that mean that if the government continues to stay in the market,
they don't issue long-term bonds
and does that mean that they're not at their optimal?
Yeah, that's something good point. So I think your point also raised an analysis that maybe we should take the implication of whether the way that they try to do the gap filling is going to lead to overinvestment, right? Because when they borrow too much, what are they going to use with the money? So it can be a subsequent analysis to see that, following the gap filling's action of the corporation, right? They actually a little stay away from their main business model, right? So the main business model is not about playing with, where the bond is under provided, over provided, right? So if the way that they step out to do the gap fillings, then is there any consequence on the overinvestment later on when they borrow a lot of money, right, for a very long term? So how does that impact the subsequent investment? So it can be also a very good extension,
So according to what you say, I think they also have take the controls about the firm-specific characteristics like leverage and the debt they already have or some other some other things. They have put this into the various controls. Maybe they have considered this. If they control this, it means they have considered all these situations.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Okay, so you said no. I think he actually posed a situation that what if the government keep, there is no shortage. Then does that mean that the corporation will pause their long-term bond issuance or not? So I think and you suggest that the authors need to control for other characteristics. They already control.
Other factors.
Like firm characteristics.
So like leverage or other market conditions. Include also the firm, some financial situation of the firms.
Okay, I see.
They do this.
Yeah, they try to control for demand effect, right? Yeah, yeah.
So
Yeah.
just following up on that question. So
Yeah.
they do control for those kind of things. So I guess what is the main reason that they're actually filling the gap there if they've already taken care of all their firm weaknesses?
It's like if they supply the long-term debt, so they have there are many factors. There are many reasons they issue the long-term debt. So the supply of travelers is just one of these reasons. It's just one determinant, and the also want to improve to prove these determinants really is determinants is significant. And they also do other variables. You see the X variables. There's a list of the variables. They all take it into the regression, but they also mention that there are other determinants, but they also didn't include it.
Yeah. Okay, so you guys have any?
I have a small concern about
Yeah.
this paper.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if it's reliable. They only use the credit rating as measurement of the firm's risk.
Yeah.
But we know that the credit ranking is given by the big three like S&P and Fitch. It is too subjective sometimes. Do you think it will be a better improvement if we use the interest coverage ratio or something because it's without any bias and it's reliable data coverage?
Yeah. So I think like they use the credit ratings here actually proxy for firm reputation in terms of credit condition. So I think like the interest coverage is good in the sense to measure your financial capability, and it's more timely like adjusted than credit ratings.
Do they use CDSs? Because that might be a better measure.
Yeah. So you mean the issuance of CDS?
Yeah, because if they use CDS, you can just let the market determine how credit ready they are.
Yeah. So how market access or evaluate the default risk, right? Yeah, there might be some other proxy that we can suggest here in terms of reputation. Yeah. Okay. Yes. So thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you.
So to begin with, I'm just a little worried about the discussion group because I think presentation at least is actually how you actually digest, right? How you understand. And I think like the discussion group actually is gonna face a little slightly more difficult job, right? More challenging job. But so far, I think like the last 3 weeks we got like, I think like we always very good. Discussion. I feel very surprised in terms of amount of stuff that you can that you can create to include to make to kind of broaden the analysis, right? You just try to view this, the question in a different angle and pull things together. And I think that substantiates your point. So I think it's also very good. Like if you just saying like, oh, I think that the analysis might not be applicable, just applicable for US, but might not be applicable for Australia, and then stop. Then it's kind of a little shortage there, right? But here you show some other evidence about the bond issuance, and stuff like that. So I think this is really good. So it's kind of very convincing argument, so make your argument more sharp and more convincing, So yeah, so I'm expecting to see more and more interesting discussion in the next few weeks. Okay, and in terms of our data project, I didn't have so far time to post, so we got seminar and stuff like that. But I think like hopefully tonight or during the weekend, from a suggestion of a group that probably I'm gonna give you. It's up to you, to give you the industry classification for the firms in the data set that I provide. But again, it doesn't matter whether your points or your credit. It's not going to be matters whether you include the industry classification there. But of course, I mean, if I give you that, then you probably easier to broaden your analysis. So it's up to you to use it or not. But if you don't use it, it doesn't mean that you're going to be penalized. But I think because it's quite a very simple variable that can add more angles for you guys. It's just to make your job a little easier, right? if you got the industry classification of the firms in the data set. Okay, so I'm going to try to do it as soon as I can, because I got dinner tonight, maybe come home very late. Yeah, but I will try to do either tonight or tomorrow, you know, so then you can incorporate that in your analysis if you want, okay, otherwise. One more thing is that I'm going to post the announcement that I already fixed the date for our speaker from Federal Reserve Board. It's going to be 8th of August. So it's on Monday, 8th of August. So hopefully you... No, sorry. October. I'm thinking of October. I'm talking about. yeah, 8th of October. Yeah, so we're gonna have this guy. So he's a principal economist at Federal Reserve Board. His publication is very stellar. You know, he's got a top of publication in economics and finance as well.
What's his name?
Stefan Viran. He's French. Yeah, so he's. I think he's French. I couldn't remember his PhD, but but I think he's I hope that he's gonna deliver an insightful speech. I'm thinking of the topic is gonna be a financial crisis, because he's kind of got an idea of policy making, right? So how he views about the causes of financial crisis and what actually the Federal Reserve Board doing, right, to kind of to prevent this occurrence again in the future. You know, so based on his understanding, you know, what he thinks that it should be, yeah. And then I think after that we're gonna have our own financial crisis, yeah. And then I try to incorporate his presentation as well, and then we may discuss just ourselves what we learned from his speech, right, his talk, on the 8th of October. And then we got a week. The week after that is gonna be not a week. Friday will be no session, and because I'm away for a conference. So I already booked the makeup session. I couldn't remember. So I think it's Thursday, either the first week, the week before, week after, last week. Thursday from 2 o'clock to 4. Yeah. Yes, I'm gonna post those information on an announcement.
All of us have a crash because we have a workshop. All of us. We have a workshop. Most of us.
All Thursday too.
Yeah.
But I think I have to expect maybe 20. It's like no one show up. And what?
So you told me we can show up on 4:30.
So you told me a Tuesday, right?
Thursday.
Yeah. So then when I asked you before, somebody told Tuesday or Thursday. Tuesday. Yeah. So I remember I put up Tuesday and Thursday. And then somehow they assigned me Thursday. So then maybe I have to get back again to get Tuesday. So from 2 o'clock? Is that okay?
How about Friday?
So Friday we already got class on Friday. So I don't know. Like today,
maybe
was there a class before? Was there a class before this?
Yeah, maybe 4 hours.
Friday
we have a long day with 3 lectures.
Okay. Yeah, and right after this we got another class, right? I think somebody told me. So that's why Friday, I'm afraid, would not work. So whether Tuesday 2 o'clock? Yes. 2 o'clock is okay. I remember I put up Tuesday and Thursday, and then.
How about Wednesday? How about Wednesday? How about Wednesday? How about recording? You can also see the everyone's time available.
Yeah, but Thursday doesn't work.
Yeah, it doesn't
work. Okay.
I'm cool with Wednesday.
So Wednesday when? Monday in the morning or afternoon?
Morning or afternoon, that's fine.
So Wednesday, you got more available time on Wednesday?
Just after this lecture, 5 to 7.
You mean on Friday?
Before this lecture?
So what do you think? I can ask. Yeah. 5 to 7 may be too tired for you guys. Just too tired, I think. Like 4 hours, you're gonna hate me. No, I feel headache. My weekend is destroyed. like my voice still resonates. Blah, blah, blah.
That's fine because we have maybe 2 hours presentation, so that's fine.
Yeah.
You just speak 2 hours.
Okay. No. Okay, yeah, Tuesday of.
I think each time you ask a person, you can like take a poll. So you just don't listen to one student feedback.
Okay.
You can like raise a hand if you can see the majority of the people.
Okay, so you suggest that I take a poll,
Yeah.
and then I'm probably today August. Okay, so then.
And you can pick several.
Okay, so I can do a poll, and then I put up, and then I just give a few days for you guys to you know, like vote your voice, and then yeah, I finalize it, and then I send. So I gonna base. Okay. Yeah, so I just open up a few slots. Yeah. So Tuesday, Wednesday, or Friday, right?
Yeah. I'm good with
So Wednesday about 2 o'clock as well. From 2 to 5, okay? So I'm gonna do Tuesday from 2 to 5, Wednesday from 2 to 5, Friday from 5 to 7.
5 to 7, why is not 1 to 7?
Because I think like we got class right before this, right? Do we? Yeah.
From 11 a.m.
Yeah, so I'm just afraid that this occupied. So it's gonna be much easier that we can book this room, right? So we don't need to move. Okay. Okay, so we got like okay, so we continue with our session about equity and debt financing. Okay, so this is one of the interesting paper. I think like if you got the time to read and you're gonna understand, I think a little more about the commercial market. You know, so I think the paper that we discuss or we present from you guys is about the long-term debt market. Oh yeah, I remember I got one question to ask you guys. So why do you think that they cannot find evidence that the gap filling existed in the short-term bond? Yeah. So.
You mean to show the evidence or the reason?
Yeah.
They show the, according to the data they analysis.
Yeah.
There's no significant.
Yeah, but why?
They didn't.
Yeah. So what do you think? Why?
Too volatile.
Corporation issue the long-term bonds, also issue the short-term bond.
Yeah.
As
That's
well
why.
as the,
Yeah.
as well as the government also issue short-term bonds. So like all parties like to issue.
Yeah. But why you don't fill the gap of short-term bond?
I see. Because for the long term, I guess
Yeah.
for the long term, other arbitrageurs it's hard to enter in because the cost is too high. But for short term, maybe there are many arbitrageurs, so there's no much profitable space for the.
Very good. Yeah, that is true, right? So actually, you capture the understanding of the alternative story that they try to address, right? Because I think like when there is a shortage of long-term bond, corporation doesn't need to do anything, right? There is going to be some arbitrage that be able to replicate the income stream, right, of the long term. And then the reason why they have to do gap filling is like because of the failure. I think that you got a slide, right? Because of the failure of the arbitrage in that particular market, right? So but they don't. Of course, I think in the short-term market, I think arbitrage can easily, balance out, right? And that is why they don't need the role of corporation. Yeah. So I just want to discuss that so then we we can understand the paper a little more. Okay, so for the short-term debt, so I think the paper is about a commercial market. I'm going to go quickly, just focus on the most interesting things that we learn. So the commercial market is, so commercial paper, I don't know whether you're familiar with a commercial paper. So what is that?
Also a bond.
Yeah, it's a bond, but we normally don't call this bond, but we call paper because of, I think it's similar. Yeah, but
They don't pay interest. They just like discounting debt.
Yeah. So it's similar as a bond in some that this is a kind of debt, right? So it's a kind of the way that they borrow money, right? Yeah. But commercial paper is actually, when we talk about this, it's more about short-term financing. For bond, we normally talk about long-term, right? So it's above 1 year, right? Up to even more than 20 years. Okay. So maybe, yeah, we can learn a little more about commercial market here. So what they said is that in the peak of August 2000, the non-financial commercial paper outstanding was 312 billion, okay, or 29% of all commercial and industrial loans. So what they show is that the commercial paper actually play an important role, right? So it's like you can see that it's like almost one third, right? One third of every commercial and industrial loans. And I think the paper was placed in Journal of Finance top 1 in finance area. I think the reason is because there hasn't been much study about commercial paper. And what they show is that there is a significant economic magnitude, right? Because it accounts for almost 30% of every type of loans, okay? So what we don't understand is that why firms issue commercial paper instead of borrowing from bank or anything. Okay, so there should be some benefit of commercial papers. And I think this is a paper that try to highlight those benefits. And then what they show is that commercial paper issuers tend to be very large firms, represent about 1/3 of the market capitalization and 1/4 of the revenue. So they all very large, very firms with a reputation. And commercial paper is normally very short-term maturity, even than bank debt. Okay, and then a little overview about the commercial paper market. So this is a short-term, publicly traded, unsecured debt, and the majority normally up to 207 days. So it's like less than a year, with an average maturity is about 45 days. So you see, yeah, because I think when you get to the market to issue bonds, and then you're only interested in a very, very short terms, right? Because I think for bank loans, the transaction cost is actually lower than you issue securities, right? So it's, I just wonder, when I read and I think, oh, there might be some special benefit, right? In terms of commercial paper. Due to its short maturity, commercial paper typically roll over at the maturity. And again, I think it's concentrated among large and well-established firms. Okay, so this is a very, very big number. So it's like 154 billion, right? Okay. And it's what they say. So aggregate non-financial commercial paper borrowing is approximately 1/3 of aggregate credit line used in the United States. Okay, so let's go to a little more about the commercial paper. Okay, so the commercial paper is something like give firms a lot of flexibility in the sense that they don't need, because look at that, 45 days, So when you need money, like a month, you have to get back to the market. So I think there must be something like some mechanism, right, to actually avoid or mitigate the cost. And this is where the commercial paper actually help. So the commercial paper is actually a program that they're gonna apply for SEC approval, and they're gonna apply for a maximum amount. It's like credit line, okay? And so after that, when they get the approval, right, so they're gonna specify the maximum amount that they're gonna borrow. And when they get the approval approval from SEC, then they can borrow under it without any further regulatory approval or disclosure, seeing the commercial paper exempt from SEC registration requirement. Okay? So think about this. For example, long-term bonds, it actually need a lot of transaction costs in terms of to be able to issue the security, right? Why the SEC care about this?
Care about what? The long-term bond?
Yeah. Why there's a lot of approval or disclosure requirement for firms to issue securities?
Because mostly the long-term bond is the amount is massive.
Yeah.
So they afraid like maybe the firm can with defaults.
Yeah. Yeah. So the SEC basically protect the investor, right? So they just want to make sure that if you step out and want to borrow money from a wide public people, right? Then you need to make sure that they are capable, financially capable, right, to be able to issue. So there is a lot of transaction costs, disclosure, approval for type of security issuance, so any type of security instrument. So that is why the long-term bonds may work, because they can borrow for 20 years or 30 years, right? For bank loans, maybe it's very hard to borrow for that long, So that is why maybe it's cost justified for firm, right, to spend time, to spend effort, right, to issue such a long-term bond. But when I look at commercial, it's actually very short-term. Then what should be the benefit? So the benefit here is the way that they design the commercial paper. So the commercial paper program is like they actually apply for a maximum pre-specified amount. And after that, they can borrow whatever they want under that limit, and they don't need to get any approval or to do any disclosure, okay? So kind of exempt, from the SEC requirements. Of course, there's going to be some other costs, right? When you go to the market, you need some credit rating agency, right, to make sure that, it's safe for the economy, right? Otherwise, just bad guys, stand out and borrow money from everywhere, So it's just can create a disaster at a wider scale. Okay, some dealer and stuff like that. So who's actually invest in the commercial market? Okay, so money market fund, foreign investor, even state and local governments, they also buy commercial market, commercial papers, security dealers, mutual fund, insurance company, and pension funds. And these investors typically do not engage in private information collection about commercial paper issuers, but instead just rely on credit ratings to assess their credit quality. Okay, so compared to other type of security, so commercial paper, they are considered as a risk-free debt, and the default rate in this market are extremely low. The reason why is because it's actually very short term, so it's actually much safer, right? So you see that the average maturity for commercial market is only 45 days. So it's kind of things that happen in 45 days, of course, is more predictable, right, than things happen in 20 years, right? So that is why the default rate for this type of commercial papers are actually really low. And then most commercial program actually backed by a line of credit for at least 50% of commercial paper program. Okay, so I think the most interesting things here is that they said that when they investigate the time that firms enter to the commercial market and when they exit the commercial market, what they show is that these firms have very large capital expenditure and large decrease of cash holdings prior to entering the commercial market. So they just wonder, it suggested that firms finance very long-term projects with short-term debt. Okay, so I think that when they investigate when firms enter to the commercial market, they find that these guys normally have a very long-term project. And when we see the majority of commercial paper, we see the mismatch. So what do you think is going on here? Why firms do the way that they are doing? Because in general, we don't want that kind of mismatch, right, in majority. Because it's very risky, right? Yeah. So why when they got let's say they got a 10 years project, so why at that time they're gonna enter to a commercial market instead of issue long-term bonds?
Lower cost.
Lower cost, but actually higher risk, right? Because they need a long term and now they need cash flow out to pay back short term. So I agree. It may to begin with maybe lower than the long term bond, but I mean the risk is also very high.
So from kind of 60 if they bond. So if the investment is not good, they can exist.
But they can, but it's not about the investment. This is about financing. So they got a investment, I think it's separate. So they got a 10 years investment. Okay, so project is going to take 10 years. But then why they borrow money short term? Why don't they borrow money long term? Because if there is something wrong with the project, they got time to, to be flexible.
Maybe just the cash shortage. Maybe they maybe have some other cash inflow which can replenish this
to make up with the
Maybe
but
there's like a gap between the time when they need the money now, but maybe the money came in maybe just like 30 days.
Yeah, I agree that can be a possible reason. But then why? Because I think like in any case for a project, never they use every money from their own, right? Because if you use everything from your own, that means like you have no debt financing, totally 100% equity finance. And what is the disadvantage? Tax shield, right? You cannot reduce your tax. So there was always incentive to borrow money. So then why don't they borrow for 10 years? Why they borrow only 45 days?
Maybe they just want to tax you right now. Maybe they have enough retained earning, but they maybe at this period they want to have some tax shield, so maybe they borrow some.
But it's a very exceptional case. Yeah, I agree. I think that it can happen because it's some exception. But I think the average firms, it may not reflect the behavior of the average firm.
Maybe
You somehow
maybe not
say.
you have more restrictions.
You mean like for the long-term bond?
Yeah.
More restriction.
Yeah.
Like what?
It will restrict it will more conventions, so the firm cannot do what they want. That will have
So,
more.
but then if they do, but if they try, if they put effort to begin with, once they guarantee the funding for 10 years.
Because they don't want to change their capital structure.
Yeah, why?
Because if you borrow long-term debts, your capital structure is going to change, and you cannot, once you have reached the optimal capital structure, you cannot get extra benefit from tax shield.
Yeah. So let's look at this. For example, if I got, okay, so this is a balance sheet, right? So this is the debt, this is equity, right? And this is asset, okay? So if I, let's say my current debt is like this, and let's say I got a project, let's say 500 million investment, right? And this project is 10 years investment. Do you think that I'm going to spend 500 the first year?
Probably no.
Yeah, likely, very likely no, right? So this is an investment gonna take 5-10 years. Let's say maybe the Hollywood movies, right? Or maybe non-Hollywood maybe doesn't take that long. I think maybe only 2 or 3 years maximum, right? Maybe another project.
Medicine.
Medicine or something, right? This project may take 10 years, And then together, when they do the project evaluation, they estimate the investment is going to be 500 million. But do they use 500 million at once the first year of the project? Unlikely, right? Very unlikely. So as you said, I agree. One point is correct in the sense that if you issue long-term bond for 10 years, jump right here, what's gonna happen? It's gonna increase your leverage ratio right away. It's gonna increase your asset right away. And then the cash inflows doesn't really get the inflows soon enough, right? To balance things out. And the stock market, we're gonna see the drop, significant drop of EPS, right? Earning per share. Is that right? Because your total asset is actually boom immediately, like just in a year, like it just increased by 20%. But your cash inflow, you don't have cash inflows. Okay? So if you let the 500 million here sitting there, waiting for you to use, right, during the next 5 years, then what happens is that the return that you get from this asset cannot be compensated with the current good returns that you're having now, right? Because all the projects are ongoing, they actually generating good returns, right? And then the new project takes time, right, to mature, to materialize, right? So it's kind of the role at FC, right, the financial controller or financial managers, to do that. They need to gradually adjust their leverage, you know, to be able that the earning per share doesn't drop significantly because of the new project. Because anytime when you initiate any new project, and if you don't clever in terms of what leverage you're gonna use, you're gonna have a significant drop in the earning per share. Mechanically, it's just mechanical, right? Because your asset increase, right? Your numerator, your numerator doesn't increase that fast, right? Then you're gonna have a drop in the earning per share. It's gonna stock price, it's gonna plummet, you know. So it's gonna be a lot of things, you know, about this. So I think the main interesting of the paper that I want to show you is that, especially for very large corporations, they're going to use commercial paper as, they say, bridging gap, you know, because the commercial paper is going to give you flexibility just to invest one by one, you know. For example, if the first year you need, let's say 10 million, the second year you need 20 million, you know, and then you can ask for the maximum amount, and then, you know, from there you got flexibility, okay? And then after a few years, when, you know, when it accumulates significant enough of debt, let's say they use up to 300 million, then they're gonna, how do we say, they're gonna pay off the commercial paper, and they issue long-term bonds. And at that time, the long-term bond, you know, is gonna replace every commercial debt that has been used before. And then from there, you know, the long-term bonds are going to take care, is going to be able to wait until they get some cash flow and stuff like this, you know. So this is kind of, I think, the job of FC, you know, or financial controller or financial managers, you know. So I think the commercial, so I think the most interesting point of this paper, they show that commercial papers have been used as a bridging gap, you know, in the financing, especially for long-term projects. So what they're going to do is like they use commercial paper, have a lot of flexibility, and then at a certain point in time, they're going to issue long-term bond and to retire all of the debt that they borrow from the commercial paper. You know. Yeah, so I think that's kind of the main idea, the main takeaway of this paper. Yeah, and one more thing that I like about I think the discussion, you say something about the agency cost, you know. Yeah, you raised something about the long term and the short term. I don't know, maybe the paper already discussed. Yeah, I probably need to read the paper a little more closely. But I think that point is true, you know. So the long-term borrowings, any long-term bond or even long-term loans, actually have lower monitoring role than the short-term, right? Because the lender can punish, right? Can punish right away if they see something wrong. But for long-term, you got a long-term commitment already. If you change your mind, right? If something going on, then you need to do debt negotiation and stuff like that. So it's actually, I think it takes more time to intervene, right? Firm activities. But for short term, you can, you know, after like 45 days, you can stop lending a company, right? If you think like something going on, something wrong, right? Going on. Okay, so I think like we got only a few minutes. So it's kind of the main idea of this paper. Okay, so I think the conclusion here is said like, so for commercial paper, it's actually lower the transaction cost associated with raising external capital subject to the rollover risk. Yeah, and then later on they're gonna refinance commercial paper through the long-term bond. Yeah, and I think like, and they also discuss why firms use commercial paper instead of credit lines. So what do you think? Why they don't use credit line provided by a bank? Why do they use commercial paper?
So why don't they